So I'm Theodora Scarato. I'm Executive Director with Environmental Health Trust, and we're a national and also work internationally scientific think tank focused on environmental health issues with the current focus on radio frequency radiation, which is the radiation emitted by small cells, small cell towers, cell phones, etc. The facts get murky because of the heavy industry influence into the science and policy in the United States. And there is a Harvard report called Captured Agency, which details that. The majority of studies, when they're funded by industry, show no effect. When they're funded by independent funding, they more often show an effect. There are over 400 scientists calling to halt 5G because of the scientific research showing biological effects and effects to living systems at levels which are below our FCC limits. Now, I know that is often thought, and if you go to the FDA or you go to the CDC, you'll think, I don't think there's a problem here. But what is not stated on those pages is that the National Cancer Institute, the FDA, the EPA, the CDC, NIOSH, the Department of the Interior, none of them have ever done a full systematic review of the science, nor has there ever been safety limits that have been set based on federal research as to what level is safe. So in 1996, when the EPA was working on just that, they were fully defunded. And actually the FCC, which now has hired, former Verizon lawyers, or used to with Ajit Pai certainly, and now has Brendan Carr, who actually fought against the city of San Francisco several years ago on their Cell Phone Right to Know Act, which is a whole story in itself. The FCC adopted limits which are set based on industry groups. One of those industry groups, for example, was headed by the chief scientist at Motorola. So just to give you an example, that's like a whole, just like big tobacco or oil or any of the corporations that have pollution as part of their product, it's the same story. The CDC actually had an industry-funded, well-known industry-funded scientist help draft several of their web pages. We have a whole expose on that on our website. We did a FOIA investigation and also the FDA webpage, which makes it seem like there's no problem. Many scientists have written to the FDA calling for their so-called report, of which it trashes the National Toxicology Program study, to ask questions which have been unanswered, and also to call out the lack of adequate scientific rigor that's in the report in relation to cancer. And by the way, it's only about cancer, not about all of these other effects, as Catherine talked about, such as oxidative stress, memory damage, impacts to reproduction, and forget wildlife, bees, birds, and trees. They're not even a part of that. So there's just a complete gap in accountability and intense industry influence. There was a rewrite of the EPA web pages and the FDA web pages just 2 years ago. So in closing, I just want to say there are so many experts right now who are speaking out that have been retired from the federal government, just to name a few. Dr. Chris Portier, former director of the U.S. National Center for Environmental Health at CDC, who represented the CDC at the WHO 2011 work group on the issue of wireless radio frequency radiation, now retired, submitted a comprehensive review of the research in a major cell phone lawsuit, where he concludes the evidence of an association between cellular phone use and risk of gliomas in adults is quite strong. Dr. Linda Birnbaum, recently retired as director of National Institutes of Health, Environmental Health Sciences, and the National Toxicology Program, National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program, who submitted an amicus brief in our case against the FCC Environmental Health Trust, along with 13 other petitioners and organizations, has filed a lawsuit against the FCC on their 1996 limits because they're saying they don't need to update them. But in her submission, she documents how the NTP study is very important in understanding the potential for radio frequency to cause cancer in humans, and that the attacks leveled against the NTP are unfounded. And that's in her amicus, in the amicus brief of Joe Sandry, of which a statement is in there from Dr. Linda Birnbaum. Dr. Ronald Melnick, who designed the National Toxicology Program study, has been on the record numerous times talking about the importance of the $30 million NIH study, which found clear evidence of cancer in rats, which has been attacked by industry. And if you just type in and search it, you'll find all of these papers online that make it seem like there's no problem, when in fact, if you start to go to the source and dig in deep, you'll see those are unfounded criticisms, as he documents in his constant presentations on the matter. And finally, trees, birds, and bees. There have been several papers that have been just published that have documented the harm. For example, studies showing tree damage from cell antennas at close range. And Dr. Albert Manville, who's the former lead US government biologist on this with US Fish and Wildlife Service, was a co-author to this incredible, I think Catherine may have sent that paper, I can send it over if not, but there's a 3-part review that has been just published. 2 have been published. We're waiting on the last piece of it because they're so long, going over all the research. But he documents, along with other experts, the impacts to wildlife, and has been over and over talking about impacts to birds. And again, he's former US Fish and Wildlife lead with the Department of the Interior, which cited a lot of his work. So here is where we are, where the government doesn't have limits that are protective, and yet we're moving forward, opening the floodgates. And I think I think that we need to be on the right side of history.